when the trouble came along that there weren't any engines because Coventry Climax was stopping racing, and we sort of fudged around for a bit, Colin being the sort of salesman come commercial man, obviously went to Ford and said, well, I've got the wonderful man to design you an engine. His history's good, therefore managed to convince Ford to employ Cosworth to do the engine.
And the time frame was very short for that. Let's talk about that and how much time Keith then had for himself and his team to design and build that engine.
Well, Keith was obviously up against it because you know, they'd never built an engine like that. It needed designing. I mean, I wasn't at Cosworth then, I was at Lotus, but I mean, Keith worked night and day basically at his home and sent the drawings in. Not only sent the drawings in, but sent in fact all the information as how it should be manufactured. It was very stressful, I think, for the whole of Cosworth, trying to get this engine finished well enough to bring it to Lotus to put in the car. It arrived at Lotus. As I said, it was a wonderful looking engine. And we were behind as well because you can't in fact finish the car without the engine. And in those days, a lot of it was finished on the job rather than somebody designing it. So we scrabbled around and got it in the car. It then was discovered that the oil system didn't work that well on the engine. So a bit of development needed doing there. So some pipes got put onto the engine down the outside, which was to scavenge the cylinder heads. And so all this was going on all at the same time. And the clutch didn't work very well, which upset Keith no end because he forecast it wouldn't work very well by just looking at the design.
The Lotus 49 Ford Cosworth DFV was ready for the third round of the World Championship at Zandvoort on June 4, 1967.
It was a scrabble and we got to Zandvoort late, which I remember. Got told off by Colin for being late, but we just got a new transporter, and I remember in fact somebody put the wrong axle ratio in so it didn't go at any speed, so it took a long time to get to Zandvoort.
Of course there were teething problems. Wearing his familiar black driving gloves, Jim was only 8th quickest on Friday morning. Then in the early afternoon session, Jim and Graham were 5th and 6th. Concerned with an inconsistent brake pedal and surprised by the edgy rear-end breakaway of the 49, Jim finished the day, there were 3 Friday sessions back then, in P4. Graham was quickest, followed by Dan Gurney's Eagle and John Surtees' Honda.
The thing that sticks in the mind is the night before the race, is that the engine was pretty good. We didn't have much trouble with that. It was a little bit difficult to drive, but other than that, we did have a problem with the rear uprights on the car. And Keith spent all night filing up the spacers that went in the rear uprights. So he worked at the bench in the garage with us all night.
Wow. This is the designer of the Cosworth DFV working on the chassis, on a chassis element to get it right. Actually nothing to do with his department, if you like, at all. This was pretty typical of Keith, though. He was a racer as much as he was an engineer.
Yeah, and he was very interested in engineering. And I think probably Keith was sort of living on his nerves at any rate, so to stand at the bench and file these things up rather than go to bed and try and sleep was probably quite good for him.
After that, it was a question only of bedding in the brakes. There was no opportunity to set a quick time. Jim would start 8th. Graham Hill, far more comfortable in the new car, was on the pole.
You know, Graham had driven it at Snetterton and things, whereas Jimmy just had to get in it and drive it. So he was a fair way behind, because you had to do all the normal things you do at race meetings, like bed pads and so on, and the car was totally new to him. And the car had problems, as I say, you know, we had in fact to really sort out the bearings in the rear uprights, and also the throttle mechanism was quite a handful because it was difficult in the corners to apply the power in a progressive fashion. And Jimmy used to say, well, you know, it has that much power, it was wonderful. You got it round the corners, and once you'd got it straight, you planted your foot and it went off like a scolded cat.
Clark, now wearing the latest white Lesleston gauntlet gloves, gave himself time to settle in as the race began. Graham showed the pace of the 49 by taking the lead and pulling away, but after 10 laps he suddenly slowed coming out of the last corner. A timing gear in the new engine had broken. To the applause of the 80,000 strong crowd, Graham pushed the car back to the Lotus pit.
The tooth in the timing gear up the front broke off in Graham's car, and then a second tooth broke off in Graham's car, which stopped the engine. By this time, Jim had sorted out all the problems of driving it, like he would, and finished the race, virtually in first place. But when we took the engine apart, or when Cosworth took the engine apart, he had already lost one tooth off the gears up the front, and therefore, fortunately, there was enough engagement that it jumped the gap, and he managed to finish. Well, Keith was very worried because that was the weak bit of the engine, seemed to be the drive up the front of the engine, and all sorts of weird failures on the camshafts and things happened, and tried all sorts of things, strengthening the mountings of the gears at the front of the engine. None of it really worked, so he's still in fact in problems, and Keith decided that the engine was dead if we didn't cure it, because it wasn't reliable enough. So he put on his thinking hat, which Keith was exceedingly good at, and designed what we now know as the quill hub, which in fact put tiny little torsion bars in the drive, which cushioned the drive from the crank up to the cams. And it worked first time out.